Hi, welcome to the Stirrings podcast. I'm your host, Madelaine Ley. I'm a philosopher of technology, a spiritual ecologist, and a contemplative artist. You won't be surprised to hear that people ask me, what are those words? How do they fit together? And you're going to find out over the course of this season of podcast episodes, some solo and some with guests. But for now, you might want to know some of the fundamentals, which is that I take this human experience to be wrapped up with technology. We are always using technology and creating technology, and we do so within a larger, vibrant web on the planet, a wider ecology. Now, the spiritual part of the spiritual ecology comes in to say that I'm really interested in how we can move about within this planetary web with some sense of reverence and deep care. And the contemplative artist piece, that's something that I've woven into my work on speaking, writing, now podcast hosting, and consulting when I'm working on the ethics of technology. And what I'm sure of, there's a few things I'm sure of, and one of them is that when we are trying to move into these postures of care, postures of reverence, it's probably not going to happen through a checklist or a really clear and tidy framework or a logical argument. We come in poetically. We come in sideways. We are stirred into such a posture. And so when I'm doing my work and living my life, I'm interested in how we unfold and loosen into a state of creativity and artistry. When I was reaching out to people for the podcast, of which there are 10 fabulous guests, I framed it as an invitation to an intellectually promiscuous conversation that's devoted to possibility. Okay, intellectually promiscuous, what's that? Well, it's a bit cheeky to start, of course, which is always fun. The promiscuity piece comes from my absolute inability to stay in my department at the university. I have been trained in philosophy all the way through to a PhD, but I was never good at staying in the philosophy building. I was always taking classes in different places, but also going to different lectures in cognitive science, neuroscience, engineering, especially robotics, the history department, design. I love speaking with designers, certainly political science as well. And so you might call this a interdisciplinary approach, of which it is, but I like promiscuity because there's a sense of flirtation in it. And flirtation's a great thing, is it not? Flirtation's a wonderful way of buzzing about in the world, because a flirtation is to say, hey, I don't know about you, but I'm interested. I don't know what you're about, but I'm showing interest and I want to see what I get back. I want to know what this sort of like dance can be. There's a buzz to it. And so intellectual promiscuity is the spirit with which I had many of the conversations that I had on this podcast. So intellectual promiscuity, yes, but I have to admit, it's very clear that I have a type, because everybody who is included on this podcast season and who I'm planning for a season 2 falls, I admit, into some range of a category, which is that everyone within their work will kind of fit into a decolonial science and technology studies, intersectional feminist approach to technology and nature writers. And so those are the sort of like broad categories. And then the spirit with which they bring to their work is also a lot of heart, a lot of poetry, creativity, an interest in beauty. Nobody is afraid about admitting about talking to trees or conversing with the ocean. Things are allowed to get a little trippy, and the sort of non-linear thinking comes through in the conversations. So yes, there's definitely a type. Everyone is also really open to a sense of possibility, possibilities. There's brought up many times in the conversations that we're sort of in this threshold moment, of which we maybe are always in a threshold moment. And at this threshold moment, there are many ways that the next steps may go. There is always possibility. Nothing is fixed, nothing is stable, nothing is set. And the sense of possibility is something that I wanted to really bring out in this podcast because, like most people, I too can feel very overwhelmed in the world right now, trying to keep up with global affairs, a job, a family, a local community. It can all feel quite overwhelming. And when we get overwhelmed, there's two sort of things that I see happen. One is that you can get frozen and can't figure out what the next steps might be. And so there's sort of a shutdown. On the other hand, we might go full speed into action mode, into savior mode when we're feeling overwhelmed. This offers a sense of control, a sense of power, but it might not be really the most useful thing. One of our guests, Bayo Komalafe, has this line that is so helpful for the moment right now, which is to say that times are urgent, let us slow down. The times are urgent, let us slow down. The slowing part is something you've certainly seen and heard about a lot in the last years, as is necessary. There is a revolutionary power in rest, revolt in stillness. And yet, as our guest in episode 2B, Gust, reminds us, that slowing down is actually not the destination. It's not the end towards we are trying to end up. He tells in this episode that slowing is more of a place and a state of being where you find yourself so that you're actually sensitive enough to be able to hear the buzz of the many possibilities vying for our attention. So slowing down is not the end goal, but a way of being in which we may be able to even hear the different paths calling out. This is how we enter into the living conversation of which we are always a part of on the planet. I think this is something important and repeated throughout each episode, is that we're just one part of this planet. We're just one part of this ecology. An important part, humans are, of course, but one part. Let me read you a poem I wrote some years ago. It doesn't have a title. Of all the ways this earthly story might have gone, the elements gathered just so. Time and space wove their magic, and two-legged creatures covered up in skin, slow to grow, perhaps slow to learn, bold, ambitious, terrible, fierce, fiercely loving, small, delicate, tender to touch, drawn to awe and despair both. An unlikely gathering of stardust, and yet just another of Earth's happenings, floating in space around a sun that is one of many. An unlikely gathering of stardust, and yet just another of Earth's happenings. I speak more about this in my work and workshops titled Remember We're Earthlings. And I'm going to do a whole solo episode on this. But I just wanted to draw your attention to those lines as a way of framing the podcast as a whole. There is such a uniqueness and beauty to humanity. We're an unlikely gathering of stardust. And yet, just another of Earth's happenings. When we speak to Laura Francois, she talks about systems feelings. And this poem is really an invitation to feel into the wider systems we are a part of. To feel that we are an important part of it, but just one part. I'm going to read some more poems during this podcast, so I thought I would just warn you about that now. And there's going to be some music from my dad, who is my roommate once again, and a delightful roommate to have around because he's an incredible and dedicated musician. There's going to be ideas that are rigorous academic thoughts about the world, about technology, about our relationship to nature. But there's a tendency within these sort of intellectual conversations I have found to stick to the books, to the difficult language. That is such a small portion of how humans express things. And that's what I've always found disappointing in academia, is that there's sort of one form. It's often boring writing and logical argumentation. And if you're in the sciences, stuck to the scientific method and way of communicating. But as we all know, there are so many ways that humans express what we know. And one of them is poetry, and the other is music, and another one is conversation. Now, the conversations that I have on this podcast, I want to tell you a little bit about how I'm going to send them out, because it's a little unusual in comparison to other podcasts you'll listen to. There's going to be 6 episodes that are solo. For each solo episode, I'm going to be focusing each one on a single theme that I research and speak about and do workshops on and consult on in my work. These are ideas that I think are very important right now. One is going to be on robots, which feels maybe a little off-brand, but robots are a really interesting technology to look at the wider atmosphere and culture. I will also speak about intergenerational living, which I am doing right now with my parents. I will speak about being an earthling. Greetings, earthlings. And that will be for this stepping into a sort of planetary consciousness. We'll speak about agenda-free presence, or what I like to call radical hanging out. And then the last one is a big question mark. And in my notes, I have it written down as a benediction. I'm imagining that this episode will form itself over the weeks and serve as a sort of blessing on your way once you finish the season. Now, the guest episodes, the conversations, they're a little bit different than other podcasts. I'm sending them out every other week in pairs. There are general themes, the first being time and apprenticing and witnessing time. The next is poetic knowing, followed by slipping the systems and feeling into the systems. The next is intuition and body and beauty. And then lastly, we end on healing and experimentation and play. Now, the reason I paired them up is because no single episode is going to give you a to-do list or next steps or takeaways. There is, I admit, one episode where I do ask the guest, what should we do? I couldn't help myself. But for the most part, you're not going to get solutions or fixes from the podcast. what I hope is my great ambition is that at some point, maybe tomorrow, but maybe in 25 years, there'll be something that sort of stirs around from one of these podcasts and perhaps makes you go, aha, perhaps invites you down a different path that you didn't see before. Maybe it makes you notice something that you hadn't thought about. I'm not in control of that outcome. But what I have done is organized things in a way that I hope is meaningful to you someday. The pairings are conversations that I see moving, swirling around each other. I think the combination of them will be a sort of interesting mixture. Okay, now I want to tell you where I am. If you're watching this on video, you'll see that I'm in a cabin. You may, to my horror, see that there are also cluster flies in the window. It is springtime. I am sitting atop a hill in a meadow in a paddock that hasn't been used for many years. I'm in a cabin because it is my place of stillness and refuge from what is an absolute intergenerational jumble inside the farmhouse, just through the orchard, past the vegetables and the garden. And it's the same house that I spent many years growing up in. I live with my parents. I live with my children and my husband and our cat and dog, and we're about to get chickens. It's a rural life, but it's one I've come back to. I spent the last 6 years working in Delft in the Netherlands at the engineering school there, where I worked as a philosopher in a robotics lab. It was an interesting position of which I'm profoundly grateful to have done, really being alongside engineers and seeing how they create, how many of them think, and getting sort of more realistic about what the possibilities of technologies are and what the real challenges are of creating it. But I am happy to be back in the country. I think a lot of my life is spent trying to disengage with digital technologies, even though I know I'm speaking to you through a screen and a platform, whatever podcast platform you're reaching me on. And so I meet you, yes, from this rural cabin, but from the knowledge that totally becoming a hermit is also not very possible. Where I live is an interesting one when we're talking about nature, ecology, technology, politics, because to the south of me, there has been a gravel pit of several hundred acres approved and starting to be built. There is a quarry probably going to get built 400 acres just to the west. To the north, the Canadian Defense Department has purchased 500 acres for a radar site to detect potential threats in the Arctic. They need 4,000 acres for this to actually work. So that's happening 30 minutes north of where I live. And when I moved here when I was 11, the night was dark. It is not. There's glow coming up from every direction but north. The frogs are not loud anymore. There are hardly any bats left, and it is a changing place. So in that sense, this vision of being a hermit out in the country and not being involved in the wider industrial spread is impossible. And so, like many of you, I think I'm trying to piece together this life that feels pleasurable, that feels nice and interesting and rich in the sense of community and family and creative work, in a larger context that feels very pressing and is filled with a lot of terror, fearfulness. So that's where I'm meeting you, in this cabin. And I hope that the conversations that we have, again, can stir this sense of possibility and enlivenment in your life. And for our intro episode, we'll keep it a bit shorter. I'm going to end with the same poem that I read earlier, followed by some music from my father. Of all the ways this earthly story might have gone, we, the elements, gathered just so. Time and space wove their magic, and two-legged creatures covered in skin. Slow to grow, perhaps slow to learn. Bold, ambitious, terrible, fierce. Fiercely loving. Small, delicate, tender to touch. Drawn to awe and despair both. Ah, an unlikely gathering of stardust, and yet just another of Earth's happenings, floating in space around a sun that is one of many.